Why, hello. It's been a minute since we've done a book thoughts, but I wanted to talk to you guys about the newest book in the Cinder Spires series by Jim Butcher. Now, Jim Butcher is obviously more famous for the Dresden Files and also the Codex Alera, but Cinder Spires is his third series, I guess now we can actually call it a series, that has been boiling away slowly in the background. Just for some context here, this is the second book that just came out called The Olympian Affair, and it came out in 2023, 7 years after our first book, which was The Aeronaut's Windlass. So I want to talk about the second book here, but before we get there, I need to bring up a few things about the first book. Number one was I thought it had a really cool world, right? It's a world that is totally ravaged on the surface, and humanity lives in these spires, and they have cool flying sailing ships that go between them. And that's all my jam, right? I also love Butcher. Butcher writes a lot of fun things. He's my popcorn fantasy, right? I just love just taking each bite just keeps going and going and going. But I didn't love the Aeronaut's Windlass. And that, I don't want to get too into it right now, but that's for a couple reasons. One was I felt like it needed more editing. It wasn't as tight as most of his stories normally are, and it didn't give me the quick, punchy prose that I'm used to out of him. There are plenty of other books that can take a more pondering, long-winded stance, but it doesn't really suit his style of storytelling, I don't think, in my own opinion. There were a couple other things that detracted from it. He had some characters that I absolutely adored in that first book. Special shout out to the etherealist master and to the Prince of Cats. Well, one tribe of cats. Great characters, loved them, but it didn't. Some of the POV characters kind of dragged. So I mean, it was a fine book, but it wasn't something that I was going around recommending to people. I was a little bit then also trepidatious because, well, I'm going to read the second book. Is it going to be a waste of my time? One last thing. The first book also did a lot of world building because this is a very different world. It's not a standard fantasy world that I can kind of paint you some broad details and you kind of get the rest. Jim had to really go through and explain some things, including like how people are able to get fed and all that. I feel like, again, there are books for which going into the details of growing meat in vats, I would eat it up. It would be what I'm there for, is that nitty-gritty world building. But that kind of nitty-gritty world building sits in conflict with the kind of pace that Butcher normally puts in his books, right? For example, the latest Dresden Files book, as of time of this recording, is Battlegrounds. That book was like 7/8 the final battle, right? It just was just action, 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 action. And he was really good in that kind of scenario about constantly piecing in little bits of world building and complicating the world and doing it in really interesting ways that are fun to theorize about and all of that. Here, however, if you're going to get into the nitty-gritty of trade and food production and all of that, it conflicts. It conflicts. So that was what I was feeling coming out of the first book. Coming into the second book, I mean, I love Butcher, so I wanted to read it. I wanted to see if it was better, and Bottle absolutely was better. But let's get into some of the more details of that. Number one, the writing was very tight. I didn't feel anywhere that we were rambling, that we had got stuck in some exposition or anything like that. The writing was really tight. It moved forward. It kept me reading longer each session I read than I intended to. That's always a great sign. There were no characters that were problem POVs, or, I mean, there was no annoyance, right? I didn't go, okay, well, I guess I have to get through this to get back to the parts I like. Every POV was different and provided me with something that I really enjoyed, and we never felt stuck narratively. This was pretty close to a Battlegrounds style full tilt run once you got past the opening chapters. It was very action packed. There were several things that happened. The one session I read much longer than I intended to, because we were getting into these specific pair of conflicts, and they were coming to a resolution, and it had that same kind of pace build, like when you're coming up to a climax. And I got to the end, and it did that, and I had 200 pages left, and a whole nother set of climaxes and escalations to go from there. So the pace was very, very quick, very satisfying, especially because, like I said, that is what I think Butcher does best. To explain the world building comments I have to give you a little bit of context. So the world of Cinder Spires, the surface is basically death. There are giant monsters that eat people. Then there's this whole layer of mist where there's flying monsters. Sometime long before all of this happened, there were spires built, the Cinder Spires, I guess you would say, that humanity was able to retreat into and become largely self-sufficient. They still have to go to the surface to get things like wood, so wood is very expensive, and they have a whole set of crystal-based magics. So that's basically the world building that we are given for the most part in the first book. There are some politics between the different spires. They fight each other. The first book we had conflict between spires, but we didn't really get to see the world on the ground or anything besides one spire. It was very limited. So in addition to our spire that our main characters live in, which is Spire Albion, and the spire of our main antagonist, Spire Aurora, which we actually, in this book, we get to see more about how Spire Aurora works on the inside, societally. In this book, we also get Spire Olympia and Spire Well, we actually get to go to Spire Olympia, hence the Olympian affair. We get to see a lot of how their society works. We get to see how Spire Pike, how their society works, and how Spire Atlantia. And they're all very differently flavored. And then we get to see how those interact with one another. And I think that a really good job was done making these very wildly different systems interact. Like how, given that, people from Pike are quasi-pirates, like it's just quasi-pirates the whole way down, how would a more aristocratic society deal with that when they have to, right? They can't just ignore them. And so you get a lot of fun stuff with that. We actually get a little more time sailing. Not a ton of time sailing this book, but we get some time sailing, which is very interesting. The challenges of sailing in the mists. We also get a lot of time on the ground. Our first time on the ground. And the ground is a very complicated thing. The ground makes very clear that, just to reinforce that this is a world that this is our world, and it's been destroyed by monsters and whatever change. Who knows? I think Butcher does a really good line in highly destructive threats that are at once both too big to deal with and simply being dealt with. Some grin and bear it attitude. You see that a lot in, say, the Codex Alera series, where humans, shouldn't be able to stand up to all of the crazy magic that's going on and crazy beasts that go on in that world, but they do. They just do. And so I think we see that in how the people deal with the surface world, and I think that's really interesting. The other thing that I want to say about this book is the first book didn't give me a sense of where we were going. It almost was a little afraid to reveal its hand. Now, this book maybe revealed a whole lot of its hand, but knowing Butcher, whenever he reveals something, it's because he has a lot more in the tank, right? This is a post-apocalyptic world. It's a post-apocalyptic our world. And what every post-apocalyptic world needs is another looming apocalypse, and that's what he's given us. We don't know what it is yet, but he's given us a tantalizing outline. Why it's given us a great sense of the doom that only few know about. None of our main characters really understand or have sense of or whatever. So it seems like now we have a direction for the series. I think that it is. I'm really glad that I actually stopped to read this second book, because it totally took it. I mean, the second book is good enough. This is a strong statement here. The second book is good enough that even though I'm cool on the first book, I would recommend people, like my friends, I would recommend read the first book just so they could read the second book. That's how much I liked it. That's non-negligible asking. That's a non-negligible ask to ask people to read a whole book just so they can get to a book that I like. And I think it'd be worth it. One thing I did want to talk about here is how Butcher has actually created, I think, both a hard and a soft magic at the same time. And I think it's interesting. So I mentioned earlier that everything works off of crystals, it's the crystal magic, and there's etherealists, who are the mages of crystal. But that doesn't actually get to one of the more interesting divisions here. There are etherealists, and there are ethereal engineers. So people who take the magic crystals and build machinery around them. They are the ones who are creating like laser cannons and making flying ships and making gauntlets that can shoot lasers out of them and all that kind of stuff. Super cool, straight up magic. But they're working on a hard magic system. We are working on, this can handle this much energy inflow, outflow, heat dissipation, etc., etc., etc. This is a extreme world of hard limitations. Then you have the etherealists. They are people who can use the etheric stuff without needing crystals or equipment. They just do it with their minds. And the reason we can't have an etherealist really as a main character, point of view character, is that it shorts out their brains. All of them. It shorts out their brains, and so then their brains kind of rewire themselves to try to keep functioning, and it makes them all have quirks or compulsions or what have you. So that's a really interesting challenge, and a really interesting divide. So the etherealists aren't working on a hard system per se, or at least it doesn't appear to be. From the perspective of our point of view characters, they do things that A, make no sense, B, have no rhyme or reason, and C, still work and do impossible things. Things impossible even within the magic system. The most interesting this system gets is when the hard engineering meets the soft, I don't know what you want to call it, etherealism, and you get some really interesting interactions. Things that are both engineered and impossible at the same time, and how the interplay there. So that's something I want to call out for magic system lovers. That's the payoff of this series. If you like big mystery, whodunits, we're starting to build that with the deep lore. This had a lot of fun. Societies smashed together and politics happen, and politics being done with, you know, the end of a sword, conniving schemes, fights, all these things. So I definitely recommend this. I definitely recommend this book, and I hope that if you've read the first Cinder Spires and you, like me, didn't particularly get on with it, this inspires you to go and try out the second book, because I really do think that it's worth going and finding. This was a bit more rambly than normal, but I haven't done a book thoughts in a little bit, and my thoughts aren't well coalesced on this book. But I'm going to stop it here then, and I will catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.